Hi, this is our podcast about cutting it in the fashion industry. I'm Caroline.
And I'm Catherine, and we both currently work as pattern makers in the crazy world of fashion.
Grab a glass and take a seat on the front row
as we discuss all things fashion. Hi everyone, and welcome back to Fashion Half Cut. This episode is one that we've had requested too many times to even count.
Yep, we've already spoken to you about how fitting in the industry work, which is episode 20 if you missed it. So today we're going to share what goes through our minds and when we fit a garment.
Yeah, so we're going to share our fitting and alteration knowledge and hopefully give you guys some tips and tricks that you can use when you're fitting either in the studio or when you're fitting at home on yourself.
So we also have some questions that our lovely Patreon supporters have sent in to us about fitting, so keep an eye out for those. We'll be answering some of those at the end of this episode. But before that, Catherine, what have you been up to?
Well, as usual, I've been doing a lot of work.
Yep.
Beginning to think I'm a bit of a workaholic. But I went up to London for some fittings, which was absolutely delightful. I have to say it was really, really good to be back in the studio fitting on real life bodies.
Cool.
And I treated myself while I was there to a little trip to the fabric shop.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh, nice.
So
how was that?
good.
Which one?
I went to Woolcrest in East London.
Yeah.
It's like it's just, for anyone who doesn't know, it's like a big warehouse. And what they do is they buy fabric from like companies who are shutting down or like leftover stock and stuff. So it's like quite cheap. They buy at quite a discount and then they sell it at quite a discount. And it's a really mixture of fabrics. Like some of it's, it's cheap for reasons, some of it's pretty rubbish. But when you search through it, you can find some like absolute gems in there.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
And actually, okay, this is like so bizarre, but I used to work for Peter Pilotto, right? And when they shut down, Woolcrest bought some of their fabrics. So when I was in there...
did they have it there?
Yeah, they had like a whole rack of all of their printed silks.
Oh, nice.
Which was like... It was kind of like weird though. It was really sad.
Yeah, because you're like, oh, I did the collections.
Yeah, and it was like prints from collections I've worked on. And I was like, oh, this is kind of sad.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. On the other hand, I was like, oh, I've got that top at home.
Yeah. Like, I can make that myself because I've got the fabric.
How about you? What have you been up to?
Yeah, well, I kind of not had a similar story, but I had gone through a similar mindset in the fact that I went through some old boxes of fabrics, of which I have loads. I'm just doing a small project for a friend of mine who's turning 40 soon, and she wanted something made for a secret project. And so she was like, oh, can you make this for me? I was like, yeah. So I looked through all my old fabrics and I was like, oh my God, look at these old fabrics from like old companies I used to work for. And then like, they've got rid of it or it's been old season or something and I've got it. And I just went through all loads of boxes and it was just like a walking back through memory lane. It was like really cool. So yeah, I've kind of done a similar thing, but not in a shop. It was actually just in my own space. I could just set up a shop there with the amount I've got.
Now, we just wanted to kick off with some kind of key points to highlight, maybe a few things to keep in mind when you're fitting. The first one is that fitting isn't always as simple as kind of looking at a picture or looking at a garment and saying, aha, well, that obviously needs a full thigh adjustment or a bust adjustment or a tummy adjustment. It's not really as clear cut as that. It's often a little bit more intuitive. You sometimes need to really kind of get in there and test out a few things, and no one really has that magic ability to just sort of look at a picture and say, boom, got it, that's what it needs.
Indeed, it's actually a really organic process. It involves a lot of pinning in places, a bit of pinching, a bit of unpicking, cutting, completely playing around. Some garments are turned upside down, turned around. That is the whole reason why we do what we call a toile, so we can see what's going on.
Yeah, and normally, of course, when Caroline and I fit, we're fitting on a model because, we're fitting for production. But if you're fitting on yourself, there's a few things you can do to make the process a little bit easier because, let's be honest, it's quite hard to fit on yourself. And the hardest bit is to fit your back, because as soon as you start to touch your back or twist around, you kind of warp the garment. So if you are going to try and fit the back of your garment, be it a dress, trouser, jacket, or whatever, try to have a friend that you can buddy up with. Try to have a sewing buddy that you can kind of ring round and say, mate, will you just help me pin this? Or at least have someone else in the house, even if they're not a sewing person, just to help you kind of fit the back and at least put some pins in for you or take some photographs.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, if you are talking about sampling and production terms, sometimes I'm in fittings, I don't know about you, Catherine, but they ask me, why is this doing this? Why is this wrong? Why is this happening? And actually, sometimes I don't have an answer until I actually look at the pattern. I'm so in tune to looking at patterns that I could look at something and see exactly why something's wrong, like the shape of a curve or something. I think it just comes from years of practice. So don't get overwhelmed if you don't actually know what's going on immediately. Sometimes it takes a lot of pinning and tucking to kind of work out what's actually gone on and dissecting things and going back to the drawing board sometimes and having unpicking something just to work out really what's gone on.
Yeah, particularly if it's not the pattern that you've drafted, if it's maybe one that's been drafted by someone else or it's one you've bought, it's okay to have to, like Caroline said, go back to the drawing board a little bit and re-look at the pattern and try to reassess kind of what's happening on the paper versus what's happening in the fabric. So getting a good fit on a garment actually starts way before our fitting. It starts right at the beginning of your draft. The biggest tip we can give you to get a good fit in your first toile is to start from the right starting point. You want to make sure that your pattern that you're starting with, your block or whatever you're starting with, is the right size and the right shape for the body that you're working with.
Yeah. And then what is really key after this is actually measuring the body itself, whether it's for yourself or a client. The key thing here is to actually measure their body. Don't pull the measuring tape very tight, just leave a little bit of room for movement, or measure the particular areas that they need measuring if it's something quite unique. But what we mean by that when we're measuring the body is we need to measure the three key areas, which is usually the bust area on women, obviously, the waist and the hips. And obviously, well, this goes for men and women. You need to know which areas to measure. There's lots of guides out there of how to measure and good tips on measuring. If they need a particular length on a hem, that's also a design pending on the measurements that you need. So once you've measured the body and got all your measurements down, you do need to add a little bit of ease, but working with the pattern or the block that you've chosen from step one, this would then link to choosing the measurements from that pattern and linking it up with then the measurements of your client or yourself, so you can see which size of pattern that you'll need.
And on the kind of note of measuring, everybody does it differently. And like Caroline was saying, you need to have your tape measure kind of on the body, not pulling too tight, but also not too loose. I recently saw something on the internet, of course, basically saying that when you measure yourself, you should put the tape measure around yourself and then put a few fingers in between you and the tape measure to add extra ease. I don't know how you feel about this, Caroline, but I strongly disagree with this. Ease is not something you should add in when you're measuring. The whole point of measuring is to get your exact body measurements. Ease is something you add on to your body measurements. Please don't do this.
Yeah, I agree. So I didn't realise you were going to say this, but I completely agree that actually you would measure actually the body. You factor in the ease when you create the pattern or the design pending. It could be a huge garment. You wouldn't add that into, a big floaty garment. You wouldn't add that into the measurement. What we're really looking at here is, like we say, don't pull the measuring tape too tight, but leave it nice and kind of roomy, but certainly don't add in like gaps. But yeah, you want to basically get kind of the skin measurement. And when you're measuring a body, obviously you don't want to be measuring over coats and jeans and things like that. So we want to kind of get down to really like the bare bones of like that body, so we can get a really accurate reading.
Yeah, like generally when I measure a model, they're in, bra and a knicker. If sometimes they don't even wear a bra, because you want the body measurement. If you're wearing something like leggings, that's probably fine as well, as long as they're quite thin. And again, make sure you're not wearing leggings that give like bum support and push it up or squeeze you too tight, those like compression leggings and stuff, because that's going to affect your body, which is then going to affect your measurements. So you try to remember that you're trying to get the most accurate measurement of your body as it is naturally when you're measuring. So once we've got our body measurements, we then need to go back to the pattern we've chosen and measure the pattern so that we can compare the measurements. Now, this is when ease comes into it again, because our body measurements are going to be different to the pattern measurements, because we need to add in ease so that we can move. The amount of ease you add in will depend on where you're measuring, what fabric you're using, what style you're going for, all kinds of factors. But once you've got your body measurements, what I often do is I make like a little table, and then I add in, I say how much ease I'm adding in the next column, and then the next column I do my body measurement plus ease equals, X. And then I'll go to my pattern, and then I'll measure the relating section of my pattern. So say if I'm measuring my waist, for example, if my waist is 68 centimeters and I'm having 2 centimeters of ease in my waist, then my pattern waist needs to be 70 centimeters. So then I go and measure my pattern. If it's 70 centimeters, then great. If it's not 70 centimeters, then I need to do something about it before I even twirl up that garment. And this applies to all the different areas of our pattern and our body.
So now you've got your measurements with your pattern, and it's really key, like Catherine said, is to make any changes to the pattern itself, especially with bespoke clients. You want to make sure that the measurements from that client or yourself marry up to the pattern or block that you've chosen. Again, adding ease and making sure any special requests have been added in. If they want a special neckline, if they want a particular length, or a particular length of sleeve, just making sure all of these special requests are on your pattern. And then obviously that is when we do our fitting and check it on our client. We would predominantly make up a toile, which is like a prototype of the sample, not in the real fabric. Some people do go straight into the real fabric if it's quite a simple design, or it's pretty spot on, or there's no time, which often happens. If it's a client that needs to be shipped abroad or something like that, sometimes we'll go straight into the real fabric and hope for the best. But yeah, that's when a fitting comes into play, and then obviously we would fit that on the client. That's when all the nips and tucks happen, any alterations, changes, and then we would check any issues accordingly.
Yeah, so we can't stress how important these stages of measuring the body, measuring the pattern, and then comparing your body plus ease to your pattern. It's such an important stage, and it's one that you really can't miss out if you want to have an even vaguely accurate first twirl. But once we've got all those measurements and everything is kind of matching more or less how we want it to, then we can do the twirling and do the fitting. We're not going to run through specific amendments for specific fit problems, but what we are going to do is we're going to talk to you about some of the common areas to kind of keep an eye on or check, and things to watch out for when you're fitting. And there's a few things that apply to all garments, no matter what area of the body they fit to. The first one is you always want to look for balance and posture lines or style lines. When we say balance lines, you want to look at things like, is your side seam hanging directly down the body? Is your waist level? Is your skirt or trouser kind of like picking up at the front and swinging forwards or swinging backwards? All these kinds of balance things that will tell you if your garment is hanging correctly.
Just to jump on that one, Catherine, I can't tell you how important balance is. It is so key. And when people see a garment and they say, why is it lifting up at the front and why is it lifting up at the back? Or let's just add a bit into the hem. All of your garment actually comes from the balance, basically from your shoulders downwards and from your bust area down. If you've got your neckline from your higher shoulder point, your neck and your bust in line, then everything from that point onwards should hang accordingly. It all comes from pretty much the top of the garment. It all hangs from there. And the biggest alteration I always have to do is when people remove bust darts and then the garment swings forward because you've lost that extra length that creeps over that bust, and then you end up having essentially a flat piece of fabric over a bust, which never really works. And you get a shorter hem in the front, and then people will always say, oh, let's just add into the hem. It doesn't work like that. Anyway, that's my big bugbear. On to the next one.
But I'm so with you on that. When I'm not in a fitting, or particularly this last year when we're working remotely and often we're just sent like fit comments, it'll just be like, oh, add a bit on here or do that. And actually the issue isn't just that it's a bit short on the front, it's actually that the balance is off. So it might not be the hem that you have to add on to, it might be the waistline, or you might need like slashing and dropping. Balance is probably the most important thing, apart from circumference measurements, that you need to pay attention to when you're fitting.
Absolutely. And then, so that brings us on to the next subject, which is the circumference. And actually this is a really important and key issue in all garments. As you can appreciate, we're not all the same measurements around our body, especially with bespoke clients. So the bust, the waist, the hip measurements going round the body is such a key important issue. We were talking about ease earlier, so whether you've got enough ease in it, can you move in the garment, is there enough width, is it too big, it can go either way. So that's a really important issue with all garments as well.
Yeah, and in theory, this is something that you should have already kind of double checked when you do that initial stage of measuring the body, adding your ease, and then comparing that to the relevant measurement on the pattern. But if maybe you measured wrong, or you didn't add enough ease, maybe the circumference is a bit small, or maybe you added too much ease and it's too big, or maybe the measurement for the body was slightly incorrect. This is definitely something that you always need to, again, like double check when you're fitting your first well. The other thing that we should check is, can you get in and out of it very easily? Is it easy to put over the head? If not, do you need to add a zip or a kind of placket or another opening somewhere? And also, can you move in it? This is really key. It might look fantastic when you're standing up and not moving, but can you walk in it? Can you sit in it? Can you do the tube test? Can you lift your arm above your head is one that I always have to do in fittings.
Oh, it's also the champagne test. Can you lift your arm up and drink a glass of champagne in a posh dress? Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah, I like that one. So all these things are, are practical things that you have to fit or think about when you're fitting.
Yeah, and the main thing that I would say, especially from a pattern cutting perspective, is, does it actually look like the design brief? This varies. Obviously, if you've been the designer yourself, you might have tweaked it along the way. But especially for industry, if you've got a design from a designer, the key thing, and again, it comes with practice. It comes with just knowing about, scale and 3D, turning that 2D image into a 3D image and garment. That have you actually answered what the design brief is, and does it look like the sketch itself, which is obviously one of the main things, because if it doesn't, well, it's back to the drawing board, unfortunately.
So those are some of the things that apply to all garments and are some general things to think about when you're fitting. But as we all know, there are specific things that apply to specific types of garments or specific areas around the body.
So we're going to concentrate now on looking at almost like the waist up alterations. We've already touched on a couple of them about balance, but we're talking about kind of the blouses, the tops, the top half of the dress. So a key point to always look out for in an alteration is your bust point, and is this in the correct place? If it's not, then obviously we need to just have a look at this. So the highest shoulder point to the bust point on a size UK 8 on a sample is about 25 to 26 centimetres. This is quite a nice, neat little shape, but obviously if we're looking at bespoke clients, this can hugely vary and there's no kind of rule for this. But obviously if you've measured your client beforehand, that is a very key measurement to get, which is going from the highest shoulder point, which is right in the crease of the neck where it joins the shoulder, measuring down to where literally the bust point is. And again, depending on your client or yourself, this will hugely vary. So this needs to be factored into your pattern. So it's a really important thing to note on your alteration when you're looking at a toile for your bust point.
Yeah, and it's so important because all of your bust shaping revolves around that bust point. So if your bust point on your pattern or your garment isn't in the correct place that matches to your body, you're basically going to have all of your shaping creating a shape around a point that isn't in the right place. You're either going to have a flat area over your actual bust and then a pocket of shaping above or below that's essentially hollow, or you're just going to have a garment that just doesn't fit at all. So the bust point is super, super, super important. And similarly, the bust cup size is also really important. So when we say bust cup size, this is controlled by how deep your dart is. And when we say how deep your dart is, we mean the distance between the two dart legs, kind of the empty distance in between or the underlay distance. The wider your dart, the bigger shape it's going to create, the bigger cup size is going to allow for. The smaller the dart, the smaller the cup size. So whenever I'm looking at a bust, I always look, is my bust point in the right place? Is the shape that I've created big enough for my bust? Is my bust cup correct? And if not, then I know I'm going to have to amend the position of my bust point and the width of my dart. Another dart that is mega important when we're looking at any kind of toile from the waist up is our shoulder dart. And I know I've spoken about this before, but this is like my bugbear on patterns. We need the shoulder dart. It's so important. Like, we're not just flat from our shoulder blades up. It's a 3D shape. We have to shape over that curve. So if you don't have a dart from either your back neck or your back shoulder down to kind of the apex of your shoulder blade, you're not going to have a nicely fitting garment. It's not going to be beautiful and clean in the area. You're going to have drag lines. So this is, again, another area that I always look at when I fit in a garment. I look to see, first of all, is there a shoulder dart if I've not drafted the pattern? Secondly, is the shoulder dart in the right position? Do I need to change the apex of the dart to kind of move it around? Is it poking? And I also think, have I got enough shaping in there? Kind of like I do with the bust. I think, okay, do I need to make my dart bigger or smaller? How does that 3D shape that I've created over the shoulder relate to the 3D shape of my actual body that I'm fitting to?
Yeah, I actually created some coats for a client once, and it was the first time they'd ever seen a shoulder or a neck dart, and they were beside themselves. They were like, oh my gosh, it fits so well over the back of the neck and the shoulder. I'm like, yeah, because we have shoulder blades. But one of the other really common alterations or comments that I get in fittings particularly is sometimes people comment on the fact that perhaps the cross shoulder is not wide enough, or the cross front, and let's add into the body. But actually the problem comes from the sleeve crown not having enough volume in it, and it always gets hugely mistaken by maybe the like around the circumference of the shoulders. Let's say if you've got an off the shoulder garment, that kind of measurement, it's always misunderstood that maybe the cross shoulder or the cross chest or the cross front is too small, but yeah, like I said, it comes from the sleeve crown. Sometimes it is too small, but it's a very common mistake that actually you need to look at the sleeve crown more. If there's not enough width in that can obviously pull a garment and misshape it, and when you lift your arms up, the whole garment lifts up. So you just need to make sure actually that the alteration comes from the sleeve and not from the body itself, if it's fitting the measurements that it should do.
Yeah, it's important to think about that measurement as a loop. And I think what you just said about the position of that measurement when we have, like, you know, off the shoulder style is actually just the perfect place or the perfect way to visualize that measurement, because often what we do is we measure across front and then we measure out across back. And for anyone who's not familiar with those measurements, that's essentially the distance between your 2 front armholes and the distance between your 2 back armholes. But actually, when we have a sleeve, it's not just our cross front and our cross back. We then have our cross body, which is this loop that Caroline's talking about. And the whole thing functions as one, because even, you know, they're separate pattern pieces, but together they form a 3D garment, which has to fit your 3D body, and it functions as one. So if you have got a sleeve, please remember when you're checking your body measurements against your pattern measurements, this is a measurement that you can check. So you can measure your cross front, cross back, and then also measure the distance on your sleeve head between, you know, the 2 points that match with your cross front and cross back points on your bodice and on your sleeve head.
Yeah, and like I said, if it is too small, if you raise your arms up, the whole garment lifts up, which nobody wants. And actually, I worked for a company that we used to add that measurement into our spec measurements as well. It wasn't only just to measure, you know, the base garment; it was also to measure that round the whole circumference of the shoulders as well, because it was so important that we needed to, you know, fit our garments accordingly with the sleeve crown involved in that measurement as well.
Something else that we also need to just double check is the neckline. So we've talked about, can you get in and out of your garment easily, but what happens to your neckline once you do up that zip or you do up the buttons or whatever? Is it comfortable? You know, can you spend the whole day wearing that neckline? Is it strangling you? Is it gaping? Is it too far away? You want to check these things, because necklines, again, are kind of a focal point of a garment often. So you need to double check this. It needs to be kept in mind.
Yeah, and also you need to be able to get your head in it without taking your head off. Because I've got a really nice jumper from a company, and I won't mention names, and it was taken off. It never went into production because you basically couldn't get your head in the head hole. It looks fabulous though if you could squeeze your pea head through it. But
one to do before you put your makeup on.
Yeah, yes, definitely.
Okay, so those are our kind of really key points for if we're fitting from the waist up. Now, if we're fitting from the waist down, if we're thinking specifically about skirts, there are a few things that we would keep in mind or specifically want to check here. The first thing is we want to, of course, do the things we've spoken about already, balance, circ, all those kinds of things. But then we'd want to look, do we have any issues around the bum? How do we want it to fit around the back? Is it the right size? Are our darts the correct width? Are we having any pulling through there? And if we want it to shape kind of under the bum, almost like a sexy pencil skirt, is it doing that? If not, how do we get it to do that?
Yeah, and it's equal kind of to this, the tummy issues as well, like what you would say to the bum. Obviously, your bum's usually quite a bit bigger than the stomach, depending again on your client. But again, we want it to fit really nicely over the stomach. So if you've got a particularly curvy stomach or a larger stomach, or you're pregnant, or equally if you're very slim, you know, you want your darts to accommodate that, and you want it to be flattering completely around the whole skirt area.
And when we're thinking about our darts, what we were saying about the bust darts, that, you know, your 3D shape is controlled by the width of your darts. That same concept applies to your darts here. It's obviously not as exaggerated as the bust darts, but, you know, the bigger your darts over the bum or the tummy, the bigger the 3D shape that you're going to create. So, you know, if you are pregnant or if you do have a bigger tummy, then you're going to need a bigger dart in the front, and equally at the back. If you have a bigger bum, or if you've been doing your squats like I haven't for the last year, you're going to be needing some bigger darts through there to create a bigger shape. Equally, if you're flatter, or if you just don't really have much of a bum like many of us do, you don't need to have as big of darts through there. You can have slightly narrower darts to allow for creating a smaller shape.
And a nice tip, actually, if you've got quite a shapely bum there, or in the bust area, you can actually curve off the end of your dart. There's nothing wrong with doing, actually, if you're a bit concerned about the fact that, you know, you've got a tiny waist and a big bum, you know, you obviously need quite a lot of shaping in there. Or if you're, you know, got a narrow back and quite big chested, you know, you need quite a big dart, a deep dart, but you're worried about it being too pointy, you can actually curve off the end and do a slight shaping through the end of your dart point, just to curve that off nicely so it doesn't come to a really kind of savage like point there.
Savage is a good word. So the other thing that we need to think about, again, it's going back to that, can we move? So often with a skirt, if you've got a smaller hem circumference, you need to think about whether you can walk, because if it goes past your knees, or even like vaguely towards your knees and it's quite fitted, you still need to be able to move your knees far enough apart to walk. So if you haven't got a vent or a split there already, then you need to think about adding one. Again, always just test your garment, move around in it, do a few like everyday tasks or movements to test if you can actually move in it.
Yeah, and again, a key thing to look at here is about it being too tight on the hips. Nobody wants a skirt that's so tight on the hips that they can't even walk in it. So you need to be able to move in this, and this is where we add a little bit of ease into our patterns. So again, like Catherine said, do a few day-to-day kind of tasks in it. Try sitting down, try standing up, try walking. You know, you don't want to have a lovely skirt and then you sit down and it completely rips, you know, down the seam. Not good at all. So yeah, try and just add a little bit of movement into the hips, which is predominantly our largest, you know, part of the body. It's usually falls about 20 centimeters down from your waist, which is, you know, where usually the smallest part of the body is, depending. And yeah, that's where you want to add a bit of movement so that you can actually move about in it. So similarly, along the same lines of skirts, we're going to start looking at trousers and like the key elements of trousers and the alterations that flag up quite a lot there. And as you can imagine, from the kind of the waist to the hip area, we've got all the same key issues as we would with the skirts. And that's something that you always want to look at. You want to see that it's, you know, got enough ease around the bum area and the stomach. You equally want to know that there's enough circ in it so that it's not too tight, and then this leads on to also being enough movement in the hips. But there are also quite a few others involved in trousers.
I think everyone will agree that trousers are not the easiest garment to fit.
The thing is with trousers, and I worked this out the other day, is it's pretty much the only garment, obviously with your jumpsuits and your play suits, that not only go around the body like a dress, but they go through the body up to down. Yeah. So it's super technical trousers. Yeah. It's not for the faint-hearted, but yeah, it is. It's one that, and it's so technical because it, you know, it's round your crotch area, so it's quite a focal point. So yeah, it's very, very technical trouser actually. Yeah. So don't be put off if you need to redo this toile a couple of times, because we feel your pain.
Yeah, I think the important thing with trousers is, like you said, to recognise how they function as a shape, because that's all garments are. They're just shapes that we're fitting to our 3D bodies. And if we think about a skirt, it's just a tube, right, with a couple of darts, like our very basic skirt block. Just one tube, sits at the waist, goes over the body. But a trouser is two tubes, one over each leg, And then there's also a third tube, which then goes around your kind of upper body from your crotch to your waist. And then somehow we've joined those 3 tubes together to make a pair of trousers. So there's so much to think about here. Like Caroline was saying, you know, it goes around the body and through and under the body and has to shape to all your various different curves. And let's face it, apart from our bust, that's the curviest part of our body as a woman. So it's super, super, super technical. But if we're going to look at some really basic things to check on your trousers, the first thing is to check the rise length. So that's the length from your front waist, down your body, through your legs and back up to your back waist. So it's that little sort of U-shape loop. This is really key because if you haven't got enough length on your trouser in this U-shape, it's not going to fit your body. You're going to have either too much length, it will just cause bagginess, or you're not going to have enough length and it will just essentially jam against your body and create lots of pull lines, and you won't be able to get your trouser up to your waist where you want it to be. When we're thinking about our rise, there's a few different areas that we can add or take away length. So whenever I think about trousers, I think, is my rise deep enough? So is my distance from my waist to my crotch deep enough? Is it long enough? And then I also think, is my rise wide enough? So is the distance from kind of my front crotch or my sort of tummy, kind of as if I'm going through my body back towards kind of the point of my bum that's sort of furthest away to my centre back? Because that kind of dead space of the U, if you're looking at your pattern, or, you know, the distance of your body is really key. So we need to have enough kind of height through our rise and enough width through our rise. These are the key areas that you need to pinpoint on your garment when you're fitting, and you need to be able to look at your garment and think, okay, my total rise length is incorrect, but where is it incorrect? Is it incorrect in my height, or is it incorrect in my width?
Okay, so I've now got the giggles now because all I can see is the word camel toe, which I'm sure won't be on anyone's alteration sheet, but I think we can put the two together, which means obviously your rise is too short. And when we are measuring a rise, like Catherine said, it's from your centre front to centre back, from your waist. But a good tip is to measure it while you're sitting down, and that will just give you a little bit more movement, because essentially that's the move that you're going to do when you're in your trousers. So it just wins you back a few more centimetres than when you're kind of standing up, because you've got that kind of that shaped movement under your bottom that gives you that bit more curve. So that's a good tip, just to add a little bit more in. So the rise is the curve of the shape from your front trouser and your back trouser, and your back would be a lot deeper. It would be a lot more of like a curved U. It's like a half kind of horseshoe shape, if you like. Because you've got to allow for that curve to go underneath your bottom. And when we're talking about this, we're talking about like a kind of a fitted trouser. So it's quite an accurate measurement. And then the front rise is a lot shorter because you've got, you know, it's a smaller measurement from your inside of your inner thigh there to your front, rather than going right the way round the back of your bottom curve. So it is a lot more of a shorter measurement. It's a bit shallower. But the key thing is when you lay your inner legs together, your inside leg together, what you don't want to happen is you don't want those two curves to come to a point. You want it to be a really nice smooth curve there, looking slightly kind of like if you can imagine the underarm curve of your armhole shape. You need it to be that really nice soft curve of a horseshoe shape kind of movement there, so that you don't get like a point when it goes underneath your inner leg. So one of the other measurements or key areas to look at when you're fitting a trouser is the thigh area, and that is lower down than your hip, as you can see on your body. And again, it's around just the one thigh area of your trouser. And I always give a little bit more, quite a bit more actually than your actual thigh measurement. You don't want it to be really skin tight. Again, when you're sitting down and moving around, you need a trouser to move a lot more than a dress, for instance, because of the technicality of it moving up and down and around the body. I always give a little bit more than you would imagine for a skirt, for instance. But yeah, the thigh is a really key area. Again, with the thigh, it's around the similar area to where your crutch would be. So you don't want your crutch to sit too low. If your crutch is too low, then you won't actually be able to like part your legs. If you can imagine like a tight fitting harem pant, if your crotch is really low and you haven't got all that movement in the leg, essentially your legs are kind of joined together. And it's similar with an underarm. If your armhole's too low and it's joined to the sleeve, you essentially can't lift your arm up. It's that kind of same movement. So you want your crutch, if you've got a really fitted trouser, to actually be really neat fitting underneath your crutch area, and then you can part your legs a lot easier.
One other thing that I always look at on trousers is what are the pockets doing? Because often on a tailored trouser, we have those very traditional slanted pockets. And a misconception is, oh, well, if I have it on and you can't see the pocket lining, then it must fit. But actually often what we find is that the hip circumference is maybe a touch too small, and the pocket just slightly pulls open. And even if all you're seeing is self fabric, so if you're seeing the pocket bearer, you just always want to check that your pocket is sitting nice and flat, how it should be sitting. Shouldn't be opening up slightly. You shouldn't have to use some of your pocket like excess to get your hip circumference to fit the body. It should sit nice and flat.
So another area of the garments that we're going to look at is sleeves, which again is a really technical area of a garment. Again, this is not for the faint-hearted. Sleeves are a real pickle because they go around your armhole. You need to move them, you need to lift them up, they go under the arm. It's all just a complete mess. So yeah, sleeves are another real kind of problem area, if you like. Some people love doing sleeves, but they again are really technical. Like I say, they go up and down and then around the body as well, similar to kind of a crutch, which is why I was comparing the under crutch there to the underarm, because it's that similar kind of movement of lifting up. So again, I've touched on this. This is my huge bugbear, but the sleeve height issue and the crown, it often gets confused with the fact that your cross shoulder is too small. We've touched on that in the beginning area, but that is my huge bugbear, is that you need to make sure that there's enough width in your sleeve crown. And what I mean by the crown is it's like your apex of your the sight area of your front to your back, which around the outside of your arm. You just need to add enough there. It's not your bicep. Don't get it confused with your bicep, although it all links and it's all relative. Your bicep is it's from your underarm down. The crown is very much from your pitch points from your front and the back, but around the outside of the body, and it's that nice curved shape that you get on your sleeve head. From there, it's kind of called the crown or the head. Yeah.
Something else that's really key on sleeves is our crown height, so our sleeve head height, and that's the measurement from our bicep to our shoulder point, like Caroline was saying, that kind of pitch point at the top. And if your sleeve head height is not correct, if it doesn't match your armhole, then your sleeve isn't going to hang correctly. So obviously, depending on the type of garment you're fitting, we have different sleeve head heights that are appropriate and different sort of compromises that we come to. But for a fitted garment, your sleeve should be nice and clean. For something like a t-shirt, you expect there to be a whole bunch of drag lines because you've compromised on your sleeve head height to be able to get your sleeve width through your bicep. But one little tip that I wanted to share, if you're fitting a fitted garment and you want a beautiful, clean sleeve and you're struggling to get that, all you need to do is pin your sleeve at the shoulder point or the pitch point, leave the rest of your armhole unstitched or unpicked, and just stand naturally with your arm in the garment, and then get a couple of pins and just start pinning your sleeve head onto your armhole. And you kind of want to do this from your shoulder down to kind of where your sleeve starts to dip under the arm. And then try to do this quite carefully, but just slowly lift your arm away ever so slightly from your body and just stick a pin holding together basically the underarm points of your sleeve. And then when you take your garment off, you'll see that your sleeve just naturally hangs where it wanted to hang. And if your sleeve head height isn't correct, this is when you'll know, because your underarm points will either be aligned, which means perfect, sleeve head height is correct, or you'll have a step where your sleeve underarm point is either higher or lower than your bodice underarm point. And if you can get that right, then your sleeve honestly will just be so much better. And kind of doing this more organic approach to sleeve fitting is the best way that I can recommend doing a sleeve.
Yeah, actually, Catherine, I wouldn't agree more. And recently I've had an alteration from a client because the cuff was picking up on the outside edge of the sleeve. And so, yeah, so this is similar vibe to what we were saying about the whole balance thing. People think, oh, you know, like an easy out is just to add on to the cuff length, similarly like we would do to the front hem length if it's picking up, but actually it comes from the top. If you kind of backtrack, you know, and actually see where it's hanging from, you'll see where the initial problem comes from. And actually, if you've got a cuff usually that's picking up on the outside edge, like a shirt cuff for instance, just follow that line up, and it often comes from the sleeve crown. And so actually if you unpick from your pitch points, and like you said, you leave it and you just organically kind of pin that and let that drop down, let that movement fall down, and you'll see what you're missing, and that's then what you add into the top of that sleeve crown. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah, you can do it the other way. So the way that I was saying was to leave it pinned at the sleeve head and then pin under the arm. But you can also do it this other way that Caroline was saying, leave it pinned at the underarm and unpick the upper section and through your shoulder, and then slowly pin that in as well. Either way works, because you're still going to find out what you're lacking in that height. Another area that I always check on a sleeve is my bicep measurement. So this is obviously linked to our sleeve head height. We have a whole episode actually all about sleeves on Patreon, which kind of discusses this relationship between our sleeve head height, our sleeve measurement, and our bicep. So I'm not going to delve too much into that now because it does get quite complex, but just bear in mind that your sleeve head height is linked to your bicep measurement. And your bicep measurement is the circumference measurement of kind of your bicep, obviously your arm, and on a pattern we measure that between our underarm points in a straight line or slightly below that. And if this isn't big enough and doesn't have enough ease, then you're obviously not going to be comfortable, and you're also not going to be able to move. So when we do that kind of champagne glass or tube test, you have to check if you can move, and if you can't, often the bicep measurement is something that could be wrong in that area.
And probably one of the main alterations, and one of the ones that flags up all the time, is the sleeve is pretty much too long or too short. And again, that's an easy alteration to do. There are standard measurements, but again, if you've got a client, this will vary obviously depending on the length of their arm, and obviously style depending. This will change with the design, so it's not always fixed. But if it's looking too long for the design or too short, one of the easiest alterations to do on this, on your pattern, if you've got a really nice sleeve crown and a really lovely sleeve head shape and it's all beautiful and you don't want to touch that bit, it's certainly not affected in that way at all. It's all in the length of the sleeve, and you've got a really nice cuff, or you've got it all tucked up beautifully and a nice tucks into a lovely cuff, shirt cuff or something like that. A really easy alteration to do is just quite literally slice right the way across the pattern, from left to right or whatever, and then slice in or out the length, keeping the crown and the cuff exactly where it is, and then take it out up or down, whether you're lengthening or shortening your pattern, add in the paper or minus it, and then just marry up your underarm points back down to your cuff again, making sure that that's a really nice line, and marrying it up to the other side, of course, making sure it's all parallel and running along the grain line. But that's a really good, easy sleeve alteration to do. You can do it in about 2 seconds flat, and that would be a problem solved for a sleeve alteration length.
So like we mentioned, one of the benefits that our Patreon supporters get is that they can submit questions for any upcoming episodes that we're recording, and we have 3 questions from our lovely supporters here that we wanted to share with you guys and share the answers. So the first one is from Worthy Design Studio, and she's asked, so when drafting a block to waist length, things often go a bit awry for me when I extend it to the hip line. It's like those extended darts just aren't my friend. Are there any common issues that you find arise when extending a block beyond the waistline?
Well, yeah, there are a few common issues. I mean, the main thing is to look out for really is the size of your darts, and especially if you've got quite a shapely bodice and you're going to the waist, like you say, but then want to extend down. You don't then want to have a really acute side seam shape that goes like really in, for instance, at your waist and then really like kind of wide out at your hip. You want that to be quite a nice, smooth measurement. You obviously need to have some shaping in it, but don't get too bogged down with measurements and it has to be 3 centimeters. You know, like if you're doing it organically or doing it for a client and it's looking a bit awry, like you say, you know, add a little bit more into the waist so it's a smoother line, or take a bit more out the hip so it's not so curved. You know, it's all, again, it's quite an organic process and it's a very creative process. So that side seam line particularly, it never wants to be that acute and harsh, otherwise you'll get a really, you know, pinched in waist and a really, you know, Mickey Mouse ears shaped kind of hip on the side. So the side seam shape's very important, which again lends itself quite nicely to the darts on the internal, which are the fisheye darts. You don't want them to be too harsh or not harsh enough, you know, too deep or whatnot, because then you'll end up with them being really pointy at the ends. If you don't lengthen them long enough, you know, they'll be really short, dumpy little darts. So again, if you're doing it particularly for bespoke, you can customize the length of your darts slightly. You can lengthen them, shorten them, make them wider slightly, but whatever you take out from the dart, add that back in the waist. Don't forget to keep on, you know, making sure that you've got your correct waist and hip measurements, whatever they may be. You can displace them a little bit in different places.
Something that I often see in my classes or with my students is that when we draft the basic bodice block going to the waistline, we can obviously make that waistline very fitted because it comes in, and then you know, if you're making it into a dress, you can just stitch a skirt onto the bottom. And within making that waistline very fitted, we obviously add in our dart going from our bust to our waist. Now, when you have a waist seam, you can make that dart quite wide, and I know for my personal block that dart is about 4 centimeters deep. But if I then take my basic bodice block and I extend that, I extend my waistline down to create a hip line so that I no longer have a waist seam, I wouldn't then create a fisheye dart that's 4 centimeters deep, because like Caroline said, it's going to be really pokey, it's going to pull, and it's going to kind of cause a lot of issues. Generally, our fisheye dart at the front should be about a maximum of 2.5 centimeters at the widest point at the waist. So what you have to do is you have to pivot some of your bigger waist dart up into your horizontal bust dart so that you can get a smaller dart there. Or what you can do is you can kind of distribute it slightly differently. It's a bit complex, so I'm not going to go too much into it. But for me, I prefer the pivoting method where I just shimmy some of my waist dart width into my bust dart width, and then I can get a smaller dart, and then I start to construct my fisheye dart from there, and then I start to think about my hip curve, like Caroline was saying. Just try to keep that really nice and smooth going through there. You don't want any like horrible angles or points or corners or anything through there. I
like the word shimmy.
Shimmy on in. We'll just shimmy that over there.
Shimmy some volume out there. That's good. I like that technicality. And actually, on my personal block that goes down to my hip, I've actually got 2 different points from my waist down on my fisheye dart there, and one is a loose fitting one, which basically is a shorter point, so I've got more width around my hip, and then I've got another point which is slightly longer, I want to say about probably 2 or 3 centimeters longer, and that's for if I want it really slim fitting and a really snug fit. So I've kind of got 2 variations of fit there on my lower point of my dart there, which is quite interesting.
Oh, that's a nice idea. I like that.
Yeah, I've done that for a while, and I worked for a company again that we had the kind of the classic length, I suppose, if you want to call it that, and then a really not like elongated kind of long dart if we wanted it kind of quite like flat fitting. It just gives it a very nice snug fit. But yeah, you need to add a bit of ease in for that one because anyway, so I've got my 2 different points there. So we've got another question from Glenys. So any tips or tricks for getting rid of bagginess around the centre front of pants when the body you're trying to fit has big thighs? Thank you. Cute.
This is a tricky one because, like we said, trousers are so technical. And one way that we have to think about our trousers is we have to think about the void between our body and our garment. And this might be getting a bit abstract, but when we think about contouring our basic bodice block to our bust, the really obvious thing that I always speak about is if you take a ruler and put it at your bust and down, and then put it down to your waist, there's an empty space between the ruler and the crease at the bottom of your bust. This is what I mean by the void between our fabric and our body, and it applies to our crotch area as well. If you have a little bit of a tummy and you have prominent thighs, if you then get a ruler, put it from your tummy to your thigh, you'll see that where your natural kind of like pelvic crease is, there's a void between the fabric and your body. And this is one of the reasons that we often have kind of bagginess or drag lines through that area, because we're trying to fit a flat piece of fabric through a round part of the body and over a void. So my tip would be to kind of think about that void and think about how you can work around it. Can you use your centre front or your front rise as an area to pin out a little bit? If you do pin out a little bit more through your front rise, do you need to add on a bit more ease at the side seam? Or can you do something clever, kind of like we do with jeans, maybe make your front rise a little bit shorter, but add a little bit onto your back rise so that you're almost like pulling the front rise through to the back to kind of, again, shape to that void. With trousers, it's so organic, and I think one of the things you have to just do is experiment. And, whether that's amending your pattern and retoiling quite a few times, or even if that's taking your single toile and stitching, taking out 5mm here, putting a stitch in it, trying it on again, photographing it, seeing what it does, take it off, take 5mm out or add 5mm in somewhere else, stitch it, photograph it, see what it does. I think experimentation is probably key here.
Yeah, and actually that's why we were saying don't be afraid to toile and toile again your trouser, because they are super technical. I'd actually say they're probably one of the most tricksy pieces of pattern making there is going. So yeah, don't be put off by that, but they're very technical. But another little tip you can do if you've got a little bit of bagginess around that centre front, what you find is you might have your rise might be too long actually, and if you've got a tight hip and you've got like a slouchy crutch, just go ahead and do what Catherine said and pin out just that little bit of excess, and it will usually be kind of horizontally again, going across. So maybe from your hip area or your hip bone area particularly towards your centre front rise, which is the centre front seam essentially, you might have a little bit of extra length. So just pin out that little bit of extra length, and what you'll find little bit that you pin out on your pattern, you can pivot that round actually into the vertical hip dart or actually pivot that upwards and then shimmy that out to the side and get rid of it out the side, our side seam, so you get a nice shape on the side seam. But yeah, it's just slicing a little bit out of that centre front rise there, making your waistband, it will keep the waistband exactly as it is, but the rise will become a bit shorter measurement, and then the bagginess will hopefully disappear. But again, all clients are different, so just play around. Play around. I know that's easier said than done, but it really is a thing.
Something that I find quite helpful when I'm fitting trousers is, and I know this sounds a bit strange, but to fit one leg, so fit a half toile. And this isn't helpful to get the perfect fit on a trouser, but this is helpful to understand how trousers function, because you can put on one leg, pin it to, you know, whatever you're wearing, a vest top or whatever, at the waist, and then you can pull at various parts of the rise, and you can really accurately see exactly what happens to that trouser leg. And it's much easier with one trouser leg than it is with two, because, you know, otherwise it's really tricky to get your hand in to like pull the rise and kind of play around a little bit. And like I said, this really is just to experiment and understand how that rise functions and what certain things will do, because particularly in the front crotch area, what you can do is sort of pull your seam allowance in the opposite direction, and you'll see what drag lines that creates. And now the amendment of that, if on a trouser pattern, would be to scoop out your front rise. That's what you're doing there. You're reducing that front rise scoop. So think about how you're pulling the trouser and think about what that would look like on the pattern, just to kind of give you a good understanding of how the rise functions and how different movements or amendments to that rise will affect your trouser leg. We also have a question from Melissa. When drafting blocks from directions in a book, what are some of the common areas that you find need the most significant amendments? I got the metric pattern cutting books for menswear and women's wear, and have done a men's shirt block and a women's coat block, which both seem pretty decent. But in the past, I've not been meticulous enough with my blocks, so I'm wondering if there is anything I should be looking out for.
Yeah, okay, good question. So when I'm drafting a block, especially from a book, I mean, actually, there are so many charts of measurements out there at the moment. Well, these days, I mean, everyone's changing. We work predominantly with a slight variation of a size UK 8. But what I would say is when you're drafting from a book, just try to not take those measurements as gospel. Winifred Aldridge has a really good charts in her books, but one thing I do find is her measurements are a bit squiffy sometimes. Her technical terms and the way she does it is absolutely brilliant, and I love the imagery, but I do find some of the measurements are a little bit off. So just again, go by eye a little bit more on that. Make your judgment, especially if you're doing something bespoke or custom made. You can see if a shape looks too severe or curved, or, you know, the dart doesn't look long enough. You know, make your judgment, go by your eye as well. So try again to not take those measurements too rigidly, and, you know, allow for a little bit of movement in that as well.
Something that I would say to look out for is measurements that are standard within the draft. So, for example, in the Winifred's women's wear basic bodice block draft, she gives you a measurement for the distance from your higher shoulder point to your bust point. Now, she doesn't describe it as that. She just says, go to point 26 and measure down 2.5 and then draw in your dart. But logically, you can look at that and you can see, okay, well, she's told me where to put that point, and then she's told me to connect that to my shoulder to make my dart. But on the body, that higher shoulder point to bust point is a really key measurement, and it's not always the same as the standard. Every single person's one is different. And I know from all my classes that I've done with that particular drafting method, one of the things we always have to do in the class is once we've drafted it, we go back and we measure the higher shoulder point to the bust point on the pattern, and then we compare that to the body measurement, and it always needs either lifting or dropping depending on the body. So I would say try to look for those measurements that are taken as standard, even though they're not described as a measurement, and sort of make sure that you compare those to the body after you've finished drafting. And also don't forget to check and true your patterns. Always put your shoulders, side seams, all that kind of stuff together. Make sure you've got beautiful lines going through front and back, no corners or horrible angles through there.
And Melissa also asked, funnily enough, also curious, what would you consider the hardest types of garments to fit? My guess is trousers. That's mine, as well as tailored armholes. Makes sense as they're oddly similar. Well, funny you should say that, Melissa, because we literally just touched on that.
Great minds.
Yeah, exactly. You're clearly destined to be a pattern maker, so you're on the right path and you clearly get it. That, yeah, not only is it around the body, but it's up and down the body as well. It's a very technical fit, and it needs to be one that, you know, if there's no room for error, because a sleeve crown on a garment or a sleeve head or a crutch that looks funny, you know, affects the whole garment, and it's a very obvious mistake if you've got that wrong. So yeah, I would 100% agree with you. Mine is a trouser to fit or a sleeve head, and they are very bizarrely similar in the sense that they're created kind of with that same process in mind. What's yours, Catherine?
Agreed, 100%.
Yeah.
Trousers are something that for ages I dreaded doing, and in the industry, you know, we never really draft from scratch. We always use a block, and everywhere I go has like a few trouser blocks that they love, and they just repeat that trouser with like a few small tweaks every season, because generally everyone's like, that trouser fits. Do not touch that trouser. Don't touch the rise. Don't touch the thighs. It fits and we love it. Just amend the leg shape and nothing else.
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to do a shout out to one of my good friends, Ali, who is she's a wonderful pattern cutter. She does the most beautiful fitted trouser. And I don't think I've ever met anyone who likes drafting trousers apart from her. And yeah, you can see why she loves it, because her finished article is lovely, but yeah, they're very technical, very difficult. I'd agree, they're a real pickle.
They are, and they are something that people tend to avoid, but once you get really stuck into them, because they're so technical and they're so tricky, they're actually so interesting.
Yeah.
And you know, if you're really into pattern cutting, like I know Melissa is, just really get stuck in there, play around with them, experiment, because they are actually, the little geek inside me is like, they're so fun.
Very satisfying when you get a nice fitting trouser and sleeve head, actually, because they're so technical.
Yeah, so satisfying. Thank you to our lovely Patreon supporters for sending in those questions. I'm sure everyone agreed that they are fantastic. So these have been our little tips and tricks and things that we think about and key points all about fittings and alterations. They have been quite general, so if you guys have any more questions, pop them in. We always love hearing from you. Remember, you can find us on Instagram, or you can email us, or you can come and join our Patreon page and have a really direct relationship and personal relationship with us, and you'll get the chance to submit questions like these for any future episodes or interviewees. Thanks for getting half cut with us.
If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a review or rate us.
If you want some more, check out our Instagram @fashionhalfcut.
Or pop over to our website, fashionhalfcut.co.uk. See you in a couple of weeks.
Bye.